Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Project Umoja podcast, the Pan-Africanist podcast dedicated to uniting and empowering the global African community. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Maurice Gwakum Akisa, and I will be the host of today's episode. We at the podcast were incredibly excited to share this brand new episode with co-founders of the China Global South Project and the China and Africa podcast. As well as the chief researcher for the Africa sector of the podcast as well.
Of Africa for the Africans.
Je ne vois pas pourquoi nous ne chercherions pas ce qui nous unit au lieu de chercher ce qui nous divise.
La lutte continua.
What is needed? Togetherness. Unity.
This is an immense pleasure. I really do feel incredibly spoiled today. I've been listening into the podcast for a few years now. I was incredibly surprised by how quickly Eric, Cobus, Gero got back to me and how fast we've been able to put all of this together. I'm not entirely sure when this episode will come out, if Gero's will come out before this one, but we do have two specials as it pertains to the China Global South Project. I want to start, before I ask all three of you to introduce yourselves, I want to start with a slight anecdote about how all of this came together. So when I reached out, Eric was the first to get back to me. And I will say, for those of you that listen to the China and Africa podcast and follow the project more generally speaking, Eric always says, reach out to him, send him an email, you know what I mean? And you never know if he's being genuine about it or not. And I will say here, first and foremost, if you send him an email, he will get back to you. You will get a response, you know, and I was very pleasantly surprised. And the second thing was, this is going to be our very first episode that we don't have an obviously Afro-descendant, team group of people. And I think when I reached out, Eric was at first, he's like, hey, like, you know, Gero's there, but like, if you guys want to interview us, just let us know. I will say now on the record, you know, our project, we have a lot of ambitions for our project, and there's a range of guests that we hope to have on. I think my experience with the African continent, and I think if you look closely enough, you'll see there's a mosaic of people that identify as Africans and that contribute to the growth and the evolution of the continent. So when there's that, I think we're going to continue to see a range of diversity. Naturally, there is going to be a natural swing towards Afro-descendants just because that's just the majority of the continent. But I think when it comes to China-Africa relations, I cannot think of a better set of experts to speak to the topics we're going to get into today. And ultimately, what we want to do with this project, with this podcast, is to bring people that have deep expertise into the challenges that we face as a continent, as the challenges that we face as a youth, and to help us find some solutions to that. So without further ado, once again, big thank you to the team. Maybe I'll start with Eric, and I'll ask him to pass it around. But please, Eric, if you could start by introducing yourself, that would be lovely.
Well, first of all, Maurice, it's really such an honor for us to be here. And just in case people are just listening to this and not seeing it, Cobus and I are white. We're going to get that out of the way. Just put that out there. We can have a conversation about that because it's an important part of what we do in this space, is the role of identity and voice and narrative and all of that. So my role in all of this is I bring a more China focused. I started studying Chinese when I was 15. I've been a foreign correspondent in China. I went to graduate school in China. I've spent a big part of my life there. I live in Asia right now. I'm in Vietnam. And so in our team of just very collaborative group, everybody brings different skills and expertises. And really one of the areas that I focus on mostly is a passion for China. I've lived in Africa for quite some time. I started going to the Congo, to Kinshasa back in 2005. And I can give you a little bit about the origin story later on about how this all came about through my experiences in Congo. But so my background is in Chinese affairs and journalism. I worked at AP, CNN, BBC, CNBC, France 24. I was the editor-in-chief of France 24. And also here in Vietnam, I ran a business news TV channel. And so I've been doing a career of journalism in China, and you put those two things together, and it leads me to the China Africa Project, which became the China Global South Project that too is something else we can talk about. So, back in 2010, I co-founded it with Cobus. So, Cobus and I founded this back in 2010. And maybe, Cobus, you can tell us a little bit about how you kind of came into the space and what we did all those years ago, almost 15 years now.
Yes, so I took a kind of a winding route. I went to grad school in Japan, and I was in a PhD program at the University of Nagoya, where I was looking at media studies, particularly from the perspective of Japan studies. And when I came back to South Africa, I started academic work doing comparisons of Japanese media diplomacy, and particularly the use of pop culture in Japanese media diplomacy and then it became a very kind of convenient comparison to compare that to Chinese media diplomacy, which was really focusing on state media, a very different approach. So, and one of the things that I realized after having been in Japan for a bunch of years was when I arrived back, there was a lot more Chinese presence. Kind of it's like things that like there had been basically a complete revolution in Africa in terms of the prominence of Chinese road projects, all kinds of projects, and the prominence of Chinese companies there. So then I started becoming quite interested in China-Africa relations, and at that stage I started listening to a podcast, which the only podcast on China-Africa relations that I could find, which Eric was doing. So I was listening to Eric's conversations with people like Deborah Brautigam, for example, who's a big expert on Chinese lending to Africa. And then I started following Eric on Twitter, and he at some stage put out a call saying that he wants to kind of resurrect his China-Africa podcast, which had kind of fallen quiet a little bit. And would anyone want to work with him? So I just kind of threw this tweet into the universe, and Eric, really, as always, very responsive on email, immediately got back to me, and so then we started working together on that, and it took us years of slowly kind of building up basic things like audio quality, and kind of just slowly kind of working out the podcast, to the kind of thing that it is now. So it was a kind of decade plus process, and we were lucky in the sense that it was happening at a time when podcasting was still a lot smaller than it is now. So, kind of one could kind of fail in peace, for a while, and kind of build it up slowly. And then it became a very kind of, we originally thought it would only be a limited series. What like how much can you talk about China and Africa? It turns out quite a lot, and so so we just kind of kept going, and it slowly kind of grew into something that I think became a little bit more substantive over time.
And Géraud, what about you and how you kind of joined this group of Eric and Cobus to where you are today with leading the Afrique podcast?
Me, I kind of joined the project. I was at a crossroad. I was just finishing I just finished my master degree in Japan, and I was working for a Japanese company, and I wanted something new, I wanted something different, what's come forward. And I reached out to Eric, say, hey, Eric, because he had me few months prior, he had me twice on the podcast where we were talking about the China molybdenum and the fuss they had with the Jekamin in DRC. He had me twice on the podcast, and later on I said, okay, do you know someone in your network who might be interested by my profile, so we can work together, so we can, And I told him about my profile, and he was like, okay, I'm going to be frank with you. I'm going to be straightforward with you. I'm looking for someone because I have this and that to build the French edition of the China Africa podcast and everything. And I'd like you to join. I told him, okay, I still have few offers in mind. Give me a month. I'm going to get back to you. And and a month later, nothing panned out, and I came back to him and said, yeah, I'm joining the project. And since then, we've been together since 2022, beginning of 2022, and we've been riding this horse of China Africa podcast and the Afrique podcast and everything that we've built after that. So yeah. That's how I joined the project.
And Gerald's never going to leave us. Never, never, never going to leave us.
Yeah, Jiro does incredible work, and I think one of the remarkable things about the work that you guys do and how you guys have grown now is you're looking to capture, the francophone, a francophone market and a arabophone market as well, so that there's more context for people to consume this kind of information about China and Africa and China and the global South generally. Um, One of the things I want us to start by discussing, and I think Eric, I think it's really interesting that you have such a deep background in journalism, particularly as like the former editor in chief of France 24. One of the things that I really appreciate about the work that you guys do is that it's so nuanced, it's so detailed, it's nonpartisan, and it's very challenging to find these kind of balanced reporting on China-Africa relations, right? Particularly from Western media, which dominates media space globally to begin with. But just generally speaking, even beyond that, it's hard to find nuanced approach. And African media, unfortunately, doesn't have that big of a voice globally, right? So can you guys kind of speak to this? Like, why is there such a lack of nuance in the space? What are the challenges that you've anecdotally seen yourself in terms of engaging with top journalists globally and what they say about how they report on the continent? Just give us some insights as to why you feel the space is so unbiased and lacks the nuance that you guys provide.
Let me tell you a little bit about the origin of what we're doing, and that will speak to your question. So I started going to Kinshasa in 2005, where my brother was actually running a production company. And the first time I went to the Congo, into the Congolese capital, there was one Chinese restaurant. And I figured, okay, this proves that there's a Chinese restaurant in every city in the world. Then by 2006, I went back for Thanksgiving, and there were two Chinese restaurants. And I thought, okay, take two pictures, post them up, off you go. By 7, 8, and 9, I went back every year. It just went boom. There were Chinese people everywhere. I mean, it was incredible. Where did they come from? We're talking about Chinese stores, Chinese construction companies, Chinese shops, Chinese signs, Huawei signs. I mean, it was just, I think, Giro, you remember this. It just transformed overnight. And it's one of those things where you knew you were in the middle of something big, but you just didn't understand what it was. And so in 2010, when I moved there to run my brother's production company, and I had a chance to get to know my Congolese staff, I said, can you do me a favor and maybe take me to some of the Chinese communities in your neighborhoods and tell me about what the Chinese were doing? In the meantime, Maurice, I was reading all these Western media narratives, which, as you pointed out, it's henny penny, the sky is falling, China's colonizing Africa, China's the new imperial power, and everything was being framed through their own experience, which was colonialism. And at the same time, I'm looking at the Chinese press, and it was like the total opposite. Win-win. Everybody's benefiting, no problems, everything's great. So I was like, how can these two be true at the same time? And so I asked my Congolese staff over dinner one night, I said, guys, can I ask you a question? What do you think about the Chinese here? Because they knew that I was interested in this, and they got a kick out of it. Like, why is this white guy interested in the Chinese and he's in Congo? But okay. And so when I asked that question, it was amazing to see the responses that I got. They all kind of sat back at the table. They laughed a little bit. And then they gave me these really long, thoughtful, pensive, textured, nuanced answers. I like this. I like the roads, but I don't like that. I don't like that they are, necessarily coming into our neighborhoods, or they're not hiring locals at the time, or doing sorts of things. And at that moment, a light bulb went off in my head, and I said, that's the story. That is the story. It's the complexity of it, where the good and the bad sit side by side. So any time that you hear a story about how awful the Chinese are in Africa, how terrible everything that they're doing is in Africa, you're missing 50% of the story. Conversely, if you hear about how wonderful the Chinese are and how everything that they're doing is great, you're missing 50% of the story. So to this day, now almost 20 years later, all of us in this group share a passion for the complexity and the nuance of the China-Africa story rather than the polarized narratives. And what happens is that when you're like us and you immerse yourself in it up to your chin every single day, you become obsessed with the complexity. And it's always fun to torment people online who one day they think we're pro-China and they think, wow, this is great. I found another pro-China. And then the next day they go, wait, what? Yesterday you were saying something nice and now you're saying something not so nice. And we're just constantly confusing people because, again, we go back to my former Congolese colleagues and we celebrate the complexity of this incredibly nuanced relationship that very few people still understand.
And Cobus, what are your thoughts on why there's this lack of nuance in terms of global medias that speak tremendously about the China's footprint in Africa?
I think there's a few factors. One is that the bureaus from a lot of the reporting outfits have really been hollowed out. So kind of foreign, like the budgets for foreign correspondence have been cut. They went through different kind of like social media turns and so on. At the same time, there's also a larger problem, which is that I think a lot of countries in the West tend to they have very set narratives about Africa already, and Africa play very strong roles in how they conceptualize themselves in the world. And so for that reason, I think in the first place, there's a flattening of reporting on the Global South generally, but on Africa specifically. But then also the presence of China and the role, the engagement between China and Africa, I think troubles their conception of themselves in relation to Africa in all of these complicated ways. It throws up a whole set of worries for them around what Africa means, around what China means, but more specifically about what their role in the world is. And I think because Africa is so frequently in Western culture has served as some kind of counterexample, of how they think about themselves. So this is a very interesting kind of historical, inflection point where Africa is starting to work with other global partners, and where Africa is kind of moving out of this kind of one-to-one relationship that it had with Western development in the past. And what that does is it raises a lot of questions about the nature of Western development itself, those are questions that have become particularly acute, I think, during the climate crisis. I think the climate crisis really raises a lot of very hard questions about the nature of Western development. Not only its, particularly obviously its historical cost, and how embedded it was in colonialism, but also just how good it was, how effective it was, considering that how much of it has now essentially been revealed to be these massive problems, so in that kind of larger context of questioning the kind of the legacy of Western engagement everywhere, the China-Africa relationship becomes ground zero for those questions, and it but it's a kind of a ground zero that's also kind of denied, it gets kind of like repressed repeatedly, and and kind of like covered over in a set of narratives, a kind of self-soothing narrative.
And practically, what does this look like when you're actually talking with journalists? I mean, I watch the CNN, BBC, France 24, TV5 Monde, all of these different medias that dominate the global media space. The journalists, when you listen to them talk, they're authority figures. They're very intelligent individuals, but when you hear some of the way that the China-Africa relationship is framed and just general development questions on the continent, and when you have the on-the-ground context, you kind of ask yourself, are people intentionally misframing this? So practically, beyond the theoretical, what do conversations with journalists actually look like, and what do they say about why they report in the way that they do?
it frequently manifests as a set of narratives. Like, for example, but Chinese infrastructure in Africa is generally really bad quality, right? Like, everything's falling apart, and then you're like, no, I mean, there were some problematic projects here and there, but in general, it's seen as same level as World Bank. Oh, but are you sure? Like kind of that around Chinese financing, around Chinese labor, around Chinese, kind of human rights impacts. And then what was frequently the kind of unsaid there is the assumption that Western engagement is the gold standard. Kind of that somehow magically Western companies have overcome their environmental problems or labor problems or social problems or quality problems of what they deliver. That somehow that's been fixed, right? So so there's those kind of assumptions that then manifest in these kind of broad narratives that we end up having to kind of chip at, in little kind of detailed ways.
Right. I think that's really interesting, and like we're very grateful for the work that you guys do, the saviors coming and chipping away at these narratives, but at the same time, it's at the same time, it's kind of these assumptions. You think that the public makes assumptions. The journalists go out and they do the detailed work to find the actual answers. So it almost, I don't know. Maybe that's a misunderstanding. I see, Eric, you kind of looked away, but like, what are your thoughts?
I just did an interview with the head of a China desk at one of the major European newspapers, and I said, why don't we were talking about China Global South issues, and I she had rather simplistic questions, which were interesting questions, but they were kind of basic. And I said, Dad, why don't you subscribe to the work that we do in order to follow these issues more closely? And she was like, yeah, I just don't have time. And I think it speaks to this issue that the global South, Africa in particular, just isn't that important for a lot of these people. I remember when I was at RFI and I was a writer at Radio France International in Paris, and I tried to pitch China Africa stories to my editors, and they were like, nah, it's not that important. Do you know what I mean? And you're constantly fighting that. And they are obsessed with the US, China, Hong Kong, China, Taiwan narratives, and China, Europe to some extent as well. And everything else is kind of just secondary. And they do what I call they vacation in the global South. So they'll come for a story here and there for, if there's something big, a G20 meeting in Chennai, if there's the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, and then they kind of swoop in, they speak to people like us, and then they pack up and they leave. And they don't really pay much attention to it after that. It's not on their radar. And so what ends up happening is they become very susceptible to these embedded narratives, which are so toxic and inaccurate. And in many ways, it's not necessarily a cynical conspiracy, it's just mediocrity. It really is just mediocrity. They're just not reading very much. They're not taking the time. The information's there. I mean, it's just a Google search away. We can debunk the debt trap in 2 seconds. Do you know what I mean? On a Google search. It's the front page of Google results now that you can debunk the debt trap. They don't even take that effort. And by the way, they're not alone either. So it's a lot of people. It's not just journalists.
Interesting. And what would you say about just the journalism ecosystem? Like, is it the business model of like hot stories and makes these big media channels go for the low hanging fruit that they know that the public will consume very easily? Is it the way that journalism schools are trained? And this goes beyond China-Africa relations, even just the way things are reported on.
I would be careful of over assigning too much weight to the media, because today we're in an era of you can get amazing newsletters, you can get amazing services like ours, you can get a lot. I mean, let's not assign too much power to the CNNs of the world. I mean, CNN is a declining brand. France 24, these are declining brands. Every day, fewer and fewer people. You look at the amount of time that Kenyans and Africans in general are spending on TikTok, and you will realize how quickly these brands are becoming irrelevant. So I think there's a risk here at giving them too much power, at giving them too much influence, when in fact I don't think they warrant it anymore because of the fragmentation now that we're seeing in the media landscape, to allow for amazing pieces of content if people want it. The problem is that we are seduced by the reels, the TikTok videos and others that just consume more and more of our time, so that quality content doesn't necessarily get through. So I do agree that Western media is very influential and important, but I don't think they're anywhere near as influential and important as they were 10, 15 years ago.
Wow. Moving on from the topic of media, what are, and before we get deep into China and Africa, let's talk about Africa and China. And Jehol gave us some insights into his own experience in China when we spoke last week. But how do the Chinese see Africans actually? Like, if you take a Chinese man in the most rural area of China, or a Chinese man in one of the urban centers, how do they perceive Africa? And what are some of the narratives on Africa informed by for the Chinese masses?
I'm not entirely sure that is a fair question in one respect, simply because, the average person in remote corners of any country don't really think about people outside of their own communities that much. So if you ask what the average person in China thinks of Africans, they're going to say, I don't think anything. I never think of Africans. Why would I think of Africans? I don't think of Kazakhs. I don't think of Bolivians. I think about getting up every day, taking my kid to school, going to work, trying to do everything right. So I'm not entirely sure that question is germane in that respect. Remember that China is a largely mono-ethnic society, 93% ethnically Han. It's not a culturally diverse society. There's about 7% minority population, but it is kind of scattered throughout the western part of the country. So diversity in the type of multiculturalism that we are accustomed to in the West, that would put you in contact with people of different ethnicities, races, religions, is just not as much. And this is the case in a lot of Asia. I live in a country like Vietnam where it's the same issue in that respect. So when you talk to people about people from other parts of the world, they tend to rely on media narratives. And not just Western media narratives, but all sorts of media narratives, their own indigenous media narratives, as well as Western media narratives. And so when you talk to more cosmopolitan people in China who have had the chance to travel, who have had the chance to engage with the subject a little bit more, you hear a lot of, they remind us of ourselves. I see a lot of what we went through 30, 40 years ago in what Africa's going through. We put a story up on our site about the Burundian banana riders. These are these young men and these young boys who race from the top of the hill. They burn down to the bottom of the hill on these flying pigeon bikes, which are Chinese-made bikes, and they're laden down with bananas. And this went viral in China just within the past month or so. I mean, massive amount. And the comments were, you know what? It brings me back to my youth seeing these kids. I used to have a flying pigeon bike. I used to be poor just like them. Because you have to remember the economic trajectory that China's been on in the past 40 years. In my lifetime, China was poorer than most African countries. In my lifetime. I went to China the first time in 1989, and there were ration coupons. There was no cars. There was barely enough food for everybody in 1989. And today, where they are, it's inconceivable to think that way. So I think a lot of Chinese have a romanticization of Africans, to think that if they made it, we can make it. Or if we made it, they can make it. And there is a certain optimism in the Chinese approach to Africa that we don't hear in the West. In the West, it's about child soldiers, HIV, terrorism, famine, child minors. Jérôme and I talk about this endlessly. These are all negative narratives. And the Chinese do bring actually more positive narratives into their engagement in Africa. And that, I think, is very uplifting. So again, a long, winding answer is it really depends on who you talk to in China, depending on their level of sophistication and how cosmopolitan they are.
So yeah, I would just like to add a bit of a nuance on what Eric said, because and based on what he said last, when he said it really depends on who you talk to, and that perception that he mentioned, you really see that among the Chinese academics. I saw that a lot of among the Chinese academics in the university centers. University, when you talk to them, you have that sense of sophistication, and in with that sense of a lot of, let's say, paternalistic, in a way that yes, we were there before, and we've accomplished this, and we do hope that they can also do that. You have that sense of positivity, but you also have that sense of, like, from the common people, and I'm talking as a black person, or as my own experience, you see that it's because we had that past, because we kind of remind them their own past, the way they were before. Some of them, they kind of look at us as like, you guys have failed. You guys, you cannot make it. Because if we were like you before, we managed to get where we are today, but you are still the way you are. It's like you guys are doomed to stay where you are before, where you are in back, and you cannot move forward. And it kind of creates that kind of what we called among our friends when we're in China, what we call a kind of economic racism towards from certain Chinese. Why you say economic racism? In a certain way that you'll see a Chinese person addressing a black American person differently the way he addressed a black African person. So when he says that, when he knows that you are an American, you're black Americans, is the way he perceives you with the background of the power of the country you're coming from, with the influence of the United States, or all that. So when he looks at you, he doesn't look at you as like a black person. He looks at you as an American. And, with all the power that comes with that. But when he looks at you as you are black, but you are from Africa, it does not only look at you as a black person, it looks at you with all the shortcomings that comes with Africa, with all the stories about the stereotypes and everything about Africa. So that's how he sees you. So that's why it was kind of common to see some friends, when they were teaching English to Chinese person, they'll go to a school, the school founders will tell them, since you have a very good accent in English, please tell them that you're from America. Because if they learn that you're from Zimbabwe or you're from South Africa, they won't feel. So tell them you're from America. So the parents will be, they'll keep on sending the children to here to be learning English. So we also had that kind of experience. You see, Chinese looking at Africa, looking at black person, depending on where they're coming from. Are they Americans? Are they Africans? And that somehow determines how they approach those African people. It was really an interesting experience, and the way when you interact with Chinese about that.
Wow. Cobus, I don't know if you can hear us, if you'd like to jump in there.
Yeah, I think I think as Ro was making clear, is that so much of this has to do with the weird symbolic role that Africa plays in a global imaginary. It's like Africa is a big symbol, for lots of people and that can't be separated from the role that Western discourse about Africa has played on a global level. I think to a large extent, I think China is picking up on, and I've read research actually, kind of showing that, like, or mapping this, that Western ideas of racial hierarchies were very influential in Chinese thinking around these issues, kind of from, like, particularly in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And that is still, there's a hangover of that living with us now, kind of like where Africa means all kind of things,
Right.
And it's very difficult for Africans, I think, to escape that. Like, I think, kind of that kind of tends to follow them wherever they go. And, and I think in China also.
Yeah, and what we're seeing today in popular Chinese culture in many ways is a mimicking of Western caricatures of Africa. So we're going back to Wolf Warrior, which was this billion-dollar movie back in 2017, where, the Chinese and the whites were battling it out in Africa, and Africans and Africa itself were just background props, and there was no identity to it. And then we're seeing now this show called Ebola Warriors, where Chinese doctors went during the West African Ebola crisis in 2014, and it's a 10-part miniseries about how, again, we're seeing this, we used to have the white savior complex, now we've got the Han savior complex. And again, there's a new miniseries that just dropped a couple weeks ago about East Africa and the COVID, crisis and things like that, where again, it was, Chinese nurses and Chinese doctors saving, and the caricatures of Africans now are many of these toxic Western narratives of, starving people, sick children, safaris, lots of savannah pictures. Oh, there's always a giraffe in every kind of vista in every promo. You know what I mean? And it's these kind of very lazy stereotypes that popular culture in China is now starting to consume. And it really, in many ways, is interesting because it contradicts so much of the political narrative, which the Chinese will come to Africa and say, we're not like them, thinking about the white people. We are different. We were colonized by the same people you were colonized. And I think that's also one of the things that many people in Africa have a difficulty kind of comprehending, that China itself was carved up, big parts of it, by colonial powers. Hong Kong by the British, there's the French concession in Shanghai, the Germans, even the Americans, the Japanese, the Portuguese, were all there. And the Chinese still use that rhetoric of shared history in terms of being the victims of colonialism. I don't know how much it resonates in Africa, but it's something that the Chinese really tout. And at the end of the day, so you see this contradiction between the popular culture narratives and perceptions of Africa and the political ones, and they're very, very different.
Very interesting. And, one of the things that I was thinking about before this interview is just, if you think about the Chinese in Africa, and you think about the Westerners in Africa, just generally speaking, you're more likely to see or to hear of a Chinese individual in a market in Kinshasa, in a market in Abidjan, a market in anywhere on the continent, sitting in the markets with locals, selling our local food, eating our local food. I think that image is more present in African minds than the image of any Westerner from any Western country going to any market in Africa and doing the same.
Yeah,
All right.
it's ironic because the white people oftentimes accuse the Chinese of being reluctant to assimilate into African society, when in fact we know that a lot of the white people live behind walls in African cities and don't actually assimilate. And a lot of the Chinese migrants in Africa set up shops in local communities, which is the ultimate assimilation in that respect. So again, those narratives get challenged on the ground quite quickly.
Exactly. And to that point, what are your perspectives on what Westerners or other countries that are looking to partner with Africa can learn from the way the Chinese go about partnering with Africans?
The way they should learn, I think the way they can learn on that, it's really it's really quite difficult to answer that question in a way that it's complex. It comes with so many layers into it. Because you have the way each actors approach and see Africa. So when you have, from the Western perspective, that Africa is still, quote unquote, our backyard, is our place to protect, is our land and everything, the way they're going to approach development and the way they put to partner with Africa will be completely different from what China is doing. China has come to Africa with this savior complex, with the narrative of saying, we are not the same. We're gonna be doing things different from the West. We're gonna approach you differently. So in that regards, you have two views that are opposing themselves. That puts themselves in a situation where they don't want to learn from each other. Chinese are coming strictly for their way to say we are different, but we still kind of leave the door open to work with you. But even though that door is not really open all the time. The West is like, nah, you guys are coming in our turf. We're not used to see you the way, we're not used to see you here. The way you approach things in Africa is not the right way to approach things in Africa. So for me, the solution has always been how the West or how China can learn, or how they can learn from each other to work in Africa. It's basically depend on how African leaders are setting the tone. It's because so far as African countries, we've been failing to set the tone of cooperation, development, on all those different narratives with them, that somehow each of them choose the narrative they choose to push toward us, and we're just there sitting and waiting to see how we're going either to balance them, either to work with them for a short period of time because it's my interest to push on Chinese now and change my view next day. We don't have a set of approach to see this is how, as African, we see African must go, must move, and this is what we want when we say Chinese coming, Western comings. This is the kind of development we want you to work with us to move forward. It's because ourselves, we kind of lack, I'd say, we don't lack the formal agenda on paper. We lack that agenda ingrained in us in terms of vision, in terms of identity, to say, this is what we want, and this is how we want you to work with us to this goal. I think that should start with us Africans setting the tone for that conversation.
Absolutely. And one of the things I find particularly interesting is that, we unfortunately, and it's I think it's shown through the development challenges that we have. There's a lot of shortcomings that we have as Africans and as African leadership in terms of organizing the continent. And there's a lot of work that will be done in that space, and that I have a lot of faith in the coming years. But one of the things that we have been successful with on the continent over the past few years, and I think there's not a lot of credit that can be given to any maybe directly organized effort by the part of formal authorities, but is our cultural impact globally, right? In the past few years, you've seen the impact of Afrobeats, of our culture that we export globally. And I think what that helps on the continent, and it helps Africans have some sort of outlet to shape our narratives, right? And one of the biggest tools for us to be able to do this is TikTok, right? TikTok plays an immense role on the continent. So I'm curious to hear you guys' perspectives on TikTok's presence on the continent and how potentially TikTok can be used to shape narratives of Africans outside of the continent, in China, for example, and how regulators in Africa and in China are thinking about, regulating TikTok to be able to protect African consumers and I guess Chinese consumers as well. What are the differences that you guys see there?
So just to be very clear, in China, they don't see TikTok and they don't see anything that Africans produce because of the Great Firewall. So they have Douyin in China, which is owned by the same company, but totally different. So there is no kind of cross-pollination of African content jumping over the firewall, that isn't kind of curated or to some extent. There are some Chinese influencers in Africa who are on YouTube and TikTok, and they kind of talk about their experiences, and some of them are really great and they do amazing work and things like that, but that's all framed through a Chinese lens. You're not seeing organic African content kind of populate people's TikTok feeds or their Douyin feeds in China. That doesn't really exist for the most part.
I think kind of I think I agree with you that TikTok is incredibly important as a factor to shape kind of African the kind of image of Africans in the world, but also particularly to kind of beam out African self-expression, kind of into the world, and on the Chinese side, there is that kind of provincialism or kind of cut-offness from the world that comes with very heavy censorship, so kind of where China is to a certain extent a bit of an echo chamber because of its heavy censorship, and which only kind of like beams discourses about itself back to itself, in a way that sometimes weirdly echoes the United States a little bit, in the sense that kind of that once you're in China, or once you're in the United States, the rest of the world kind of fades into the background, kind of, and the society is mostly speaking to itself. But I think TikTok is incredibly valuable. Plus with it the very rapidly growing prominence of African fashion designers, the quick kind of rise of prominence of African dance trends and music trends and electronic music trends particularly. So I'm South African, and in South Africa, the rise of Amapiano alone, kind of as a kind of a global kind of cultural force, kind of has been over the last 2 years, kind of has been incredibly notable, I think. I think with that, then also actually, so that I think is shaping, I think, like perceptions of Africa in the Western world in a lot of ways, which will then, I think, filter in complicated ways into China at some stage. But kind of what is also what is, I think, the experience of just kind of just self-presenting, like kind of like presenting African life, kind of into kind of global media spaces via, for example, like African series produced for Netflix, for example. I think that is shaping. I think it's shaping how Africans are thinking about themselves to a certain extent, and then kind of in this kind of conversation with the rest of the world. Kind of which is really interesting. So, for example, my partner is a head writer on a Netflix series, a South African Netflix series. And one of the actors who was starring in the series was recently in an airport in Dubai, and was suddenly mobbed by a bunch of fans, kind of who had watched the series, kind of and asking for autographs, for example. So that's, I think, is just a very interesting example of this happening.
Since you're talking about regulation and TikTok, it was really interesting because a few weeks ago we had that there was that debate in Kenya about TikTok ban on because it was one MP who initiated the debate that maybe Kenya should considering banning TikTok because it was saying it's posed a danger to Kenya cultural values and religion and societal values and everything, and it was really a fierce debate between the pros and cons. And I remember one MP when he took the mic and speak, is like, people who are saying that we should be banning TikTok, they're themselves right now on TikTok while we are sitting here on the parliament. It was a very funny scene to say. But you see that debate about TikTok also rising up in Africa, not in all Africa, because when you see TikTok in Africa, you don't see that same perception that they do have in the West, for example. TikTok is not really seen under its China banners, China tool or China application that are stealing our data and everything. It's kind of seen, and it's more like this social media tool that's where you see everything else, the good and the bad, that can come and become really bad and influence the society in a very wrong way. And that's how you see kind of the debate when you compare the same debate about TikTok, what happened in Washington, where it was really China focused, China centered kind of topic. So it's China debate around TikTok. When you come to Africa, you have the China angle, but not as much that you see in the West. It's more of just like any kind of social media. It's taking time. It's consuming people and kids' time. It's just portraying bad stuff. It's promoting prostitution because, let's face it, the content of TikTok in Africa is, I'm going to talk about the DRC. Sometimes the content, when you look at them, you're like, wow, man, this content needs a certain level of regulation. But let's face it, many Africa do not have a strong regulation apparatus, infrastructure, and legislation equipped and allowing them to be able to regulate what TikTok does or any kind of social media does in Africa.
And remember to put TikTok into the broader context of Chinese technology in Africa. So the number one mobile phone brand across the continent is Transsion phones. Techno phones, itel, Infinix, by far they dominate the market. The number one music service is Boomplay. That's also Chinese as well. StarTimes is Chinese. Huawei is Chinese. ZTE is Chinese. So we go down the list of Chinese tech. TikTok is one of many apps and pieces of hardware and services now that are Chinese that, as Jiro pointed out, people are rather agnostic that it's Chinese or where it comes from. It works. It's done. And the Chinese, to their credit, customize a lot of their services for the African market, something that Westerners and Japanese and Koreans don't do. So in that respect, the Chinese deserve some props for what they do.
Wow. And guys, I do want to say that this is, throughout the interview, there's some other themes that I'm going to want us to speak directly on, but I really wanted us to start off with this kind of catch-all scene and theme, just because there's just so many incredible insights that you guys provide through your podcast. And if I haven't said this before, I will be saying it throughout this podcast. You really have to go and check out each of your interviews, because I've definitely listened to you guys talk about TikTok for 30 minutes to an hour in the past before. There's a lot of deep insights there that can be brought out. Can you guys speak to the Chinese diaspora in Africa? I think there's going to be increasingly a generation of Chinese that are born in Africa and that have their own perception of the continent. I have some friends myself that are, Chinese and that were born on the continent that embrace it completely differently. What do the Chinese in Africa look like? What does their presence look like?
Well, let me just kind of set the table with some numbers first, and then I can let my friends and colleagues kind of add some details to it. There is a lot of exaggeration in Africa about the number of Chinese migrants that are on the continent. First of all, we don't know how many Chinese are on the continent because there is no way to track this. There is no Central Bureau of Immigration that's recording visa entries and whatnot. Many African borders are quite porous. They're not necessarily automated. They're certainly not sharing data across countries and whatnot. So whenever you hear these fantastical numbers like 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, whatever it is, those are garbage numbers. They don't exist. The best estimates that people have based on research of key Chinese communities and what they've enlarged or shrunk over recent years is that the peak of the Chinese population in Africa was in around 2015. Since 2015, it's been in steady decline. Today, they believe that the number is somewhere around 700,000 to 1 million ethnically Chinese people. Okay, now there's a catch here, okay, because about half of that population of ethnic Chinese are in South Africa. And many of those Chinese, those ethnic Chinese in South Africa, have been in the country for centuries because they were brought over by the British. Their ancestors were brought over by the British to work as indentured servants and slaves in South Africa as well. So to count ethnic South Africans as part of the quote unquote Chinese is very, very misleading and disingenuous because those ethnic Chinese in South Africa are as African as Giraud or Cobus or anybody else because they've been there for centuries. So now when we look at the Chinese national population, it is, again, best estimates are 300,000 to 400,000 people. And that sounds like a lot of people, but when you map that out against a continent of 1.3 billion people, it's nothing. It's insignificant. So I think a lot of this whole narrative of the Chinese taking over and the surge of Chinese population, it's just not true. It's not backed up by the numbers. In some communities, say in Lusaka, in Accra, in Nairobi, and in Addis Ababa in particular, and increasingly in Kinshasa, or actually not even in Kinshasa, in Kalwezi down in the south, there are clusters of Chinese communities that are quite large and to some extent getting larger. But that is not uniformly spread across the continent. And so I think we have to be very, very careful in how we frame this language because it touches into some very, very sensitive xenophobic patterns that are quite prominent in many African countries. That this takeover narrative is there. So, but the Chinese community for the most part is quite small when you look at it measured against the total population of the continent.
But there's also a reality that we have to encompass in that regard when it comes to the Chinese diaspora in Africa. There is a large bunch of Chinese who've been in Africa for so long. I mean, let's say mid-90s, early 2000, we arrived there and we set up shop there. They make business. Some of them married locally, some of them did not marry locally. But lots of them, they stayed in Africa for so long that they see themselves as African, but they see Africa as a place where they see themselves living for so long. I remember a few months back, we covered a story about a Chinese merchant was sharing his experience, telling that, he doesn't see himself going back to China anymore because he said he's making money so much in Africa. It's more easy to live in Africa that, him staying in Africa, it's much better for him. So yes, we have those kind of testimony coming from different people who've been in Africa and say, Africa is tough. Africa is you have to have your own way of managing stuff. It's not China. It's not, you don't have an integrated paid system like WeChat and with social media and all. But overall, you have kind of a lifestyle where it allows you as a businessman, if you know the good people, if you know who to talk to, it can allow you to make money. It can allow you to live large. Let's face it, because when you compare the amount of money they can make in Africa compared to what they have to make in China, there's no comparison. They realize that yes, there's much money to be made in Africa. We buy stuff in China, we sell them in Africa. We come to Africa, we do business in Africa. If we find our good friend in Africa, someone who's willing to do business with us, we're gonna make our money here. That's even the story of many Chinese who now invested in manufacture, in mining industry, in many African countries. They became the queen and king of Chinese communities in Africa. They came, they almost had nothing, but just had a few thousands of dollars. They find an environment where they could speak to people, they create a network. And a few years later, they become really powerful people today. So you have that place, you have that part of Chinese communities, certain of them who, because of the money they made, despite the kind of xenophobic, despite I'd say the complex relationship they do have with the locals, some of them would say, yeah, I think I'm gonna stay again in Africa for quite some time because it's still good for me to make money here.
Right. So to carry on, I think one of the things I'd love for you guys to speak to as well in this kind of general theme and perspective on the Chinese presence in Africa is, can you give us a perspective on the distinction between Chinese presence in Sub-Saharan Africa and compared to North Africa, and then because of our interest in kind of the global African community, also compared to the Caribbean and South America as well. I think when I looked at Boston University has this really interesting map on Chinese loans in Africa, right? Chinese loans and Chinese debt in Africa. And there's a stark difference between the amount that has been spent, the amount of loans that have gone to Sub-Saharan Africa compared to North Africa and then the Caribbean as well. So can you guys speak to kind of like why do we see this phenomenon between North Africa and the rest of the continent, and then also what it looks like in the Caribbean and South America?
So North Africa, the way that the Chinese Foreign Ministry frames it is exactly the same as the way the U.S. State Department frames it as well. So North Africa is not part of Africa. North Africa is part of the Middle East and the Arab portfolio. So they divide the continent somewhat artificially. And it's a frustration in one sense because Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt are all as much part of Africa as Mali is and as Botswana is as well. I mean, you're on the continent there. So. But the Chinese, and we saw this, for example, during the COVID crisis, where in terms of the vaccines and where they went. And boy, oh boy, North Africa benefited enormously, far more than the rest of the continent did in terms of receiving vaccines. And one of the things that you're seeing in terms of investment now into Algeria and Morocco, it's skyrocketing in part because they have manufacturing output that goes directly into Europe. And so there's a bigger industrial base that's there for auto manufacturing and for apparel manufacturing, and that appeals to the Chinese. In terms of how Africa compares to, say, Latin America, and again, you brought this up, I think it was in your conversation with Géraud, and this is a really important point. Africa to China is not that important economically. In fact, I would say that Africa, and I think Géraud brought this up in the last discussion you had with him, it's second to the bottom in the world when measured against total trade, next to Oceania, okay? And so when some European countries do more trade with China than all of Africa does. And so the value that China brings the value that Africa brings to China is not what comes out of the ground in Africa, because at the end of the day, the Chinese have the Belt and Road. They can buy the oil, mineral, and timber that Africa sells, except for the strategic resources that come from Géraud's country, with the exception of cobalt, coltan, tantalum, and those things, and a little bit of iron ore and bauxite from Guinea. For the most part, they can get everything else in other places, much cheaper, much larger scale, much more efficiently than what they can get from Africa. This is a mindset shift that has not taken place in most African policymakers' ideas. And you still hear this in the narrative that Africans, they say this all of the time. We hear this in the discourse that China needs Africa because of the resources. And in many ways, I feel, and this is a little bit of a controversial sense here, that Africa in the global and the international system and the global discourse oftentimes is like a battered spouse, where they've been told you're good for nothing, you're worthless, you have no value, you bring nothing to the table, okay? And so when you hear over and over again, what is Africa's contribution to the world, it comes back to what comes out of the ground. Okay? And the fact is, to the Chinese, they don't care what comes out of the ground. They've shifted most of their oil buying out of Africa into the Persian Gulf, into Brazil, into other places like this. They buy a lot of the minerals and the oil elsewhere. What matters to the Chinese more than anything today are the 54 votes at the United Nations, the 54 votes at the World Health Organization, the slapping of the United States in the discourse over Huawei. It's politics that matters today, much more than economics matters. And that's a
with
big
it,
difference.
the politics of being a global South leader, a natural
Yeah,
global South country,
absolutely.
or kind of like the kind of unofficial older brother to the global South. Kind of I think and the kind of larger implications, kind of that kind of global South solidarity building has for Western power in the world. I
And,
think
and,
that's really where the
and
importance of the relationship lies, I think.
that's right. When we think of moral leadership in the global South, we think of Desmond Tutu, we think of Mandela, we think of all these voices, even Patrice Lumumba to some extent as well, in terms of people who've stood up to the system. We don't have those as much here in Asia, and truly iconic people who kind of transcend time and boundaries and geographies. So to Kobus's point, I think that moral strength is very powerful, but the political strength is something that I don't think has settled in as a currency that Africans need to leverage in order to better their position in the world. They still keep thinking we're going to focus on oil and mineral and timber.
You can see how China has changed in its approach in Africa. In the early 2000s, when China was really rising as a global power, the money that China was pouring into Africa, it has a two main goal. It was the political goal and the economic goal. The economic goal is like, we are getting access to resources, Angola, Nigeria, Congo. We are discovering new places, new land, and we're also opening doors to our company because of the excess that they had in China. We are now giving them new markets in Africa for infrastructure, for new business and everything. But it also had a political goal. The political goal is like, African countries were at a moment where many of them were still searching for money for development. Many of them were battling with the IMF and World Bank about this HIPC initiative, like highly indebted country initiative. Many of them were like, would I get my debt canceled? Would I get this and that? Many of them were that exact moment where they needed money. And China rose and say, you need what, 3 billions? I'm going to give you 4 billions. I'm going to give you 5 billions. I'm going to give you Angola. How much you need? I need 40 billions. I'm going to give you 40 billion over the years. We're going to pay because you have the resources and everything. But at the end, when China realized that, those guys, they cannot pay back, but still the investment that China put on the table garnered a lot of political clout for China on the global stage from Africa. So just because of that, China knows that it has at least 50 countries for sure who can either stay quiet, either vote for her, but most of them will never go and confront China on the international stage by saying, China, you are bad, you did this and you did that. At least China has won that battle. And for them, it was like, now that the money is kind of reduced, we're still investing on the political clout and, we're not going to cut everything, but you're still going to keep a bit of money here and there. But the political gain still needs to remain on the table.
Before we jump in deeply into African debt, I guess as a final question to close this kind of catch-all section, is there a future where Africans are all speaking Chinese? Is that something that we'll be anticipating? What are your thoughts there?
That's ridiculous. No. I mean, first of all, learning Chinese is incredibly difficult to do. It takes in a lot of time. There aren't enough, and it's just people have to commit huge amounts of time to do it. And time is a precious thing for many people, and the opportunities to do that. I think that narrative of one day we're all going to be speaking Chinese is very borderline xenophobic, but at the same time, I mean, should Chinese be available at universities and middle schools, particularly for the elites? Yeah, I mean, who have the opportunity to interact and to do business and to create new opportunities. I mean, I personally, I mean, I've been studying Chinese, since I was 15 years old. I also speak French. I think the ability to speak other people's languages is essential to facilitating understanding. And I think we should all speak languages. But, for a lot of people in most African countries, they're already, tri, or even quadrilingual.
Exactly.
So and I just think that, even here in Vietnam, which is on the border with China, very few people speak Chinese. And there's a much bigger Chinese presence here than there ever will be in Africa. So I don't think you're going to see, public school systems and everybody learning Chinese, but will you see it at top universities? Yeah. And that's great.
And especially when you see now the Chinese diaspora in Africa making much more effort on learning local language than African learning Chinese. So in that regards, if you're an African, even if you learn Chinese at school, when the Chinese in front of you is trying so hard to speak Lingala, to speak Swahili, to speak French, or to speak Hausa, my friend, you're like, yeah, I don't need that Chinese. Unless you re-expose yourself to go to live in China. If you don't do that, even those who learn Chinese in university, I can tell you, if you don't practice Chinese, you don't live it, not reading, but you live it every day with Chinese. You won't feel the need of having it on and everybody speaking Chinese.
But we're going to talk about one of our real frustrations within our group, and I'm just going to set up Giraud for this one. But there are hundreds of thousands of young Africans who've learned Chinese. Remember that up until the pandemic, 63,000 young Africans went to China for undergraduate, masters, PhDs, learned to speak the language fluently, beautifully. This is a human resource that Africa had in abundance. And what does it do when these kids come back to their home countries? Because the day they get their diploma in China, they get kicked out. Your visa ends the day your student visa, for the most part, ends as soon as you graduate. So they have to go find jobs. And it's very difficult for them to find jobs in China, so they come home. What happens when they come home, Giraud?
They just sit tight and they find something else. They move on something else. And
There's no job.
as
No
I
one.
think I spoke about that few
Absolutely.
weeks back. Yes,
so
exactly. When I say that,
So
the research shows that many of them are not working in everything related to China, Africa. Some of them, to a certain extent, still speak Chinese, but many of them have moved away from the old China, Africa, or China, their own country debate, and they're even far from that debate. A lot of them now are living in Canada, in the US. Many of them have migrated. So at the end, are we going to see many Africans speaking Chinese? I really doubt that's not going to happen because there's no structural needs that African countries are kind of putting out there to say we need people who speak Chinese. We don't feel that need of doing that. So that's why even if they put program in universities, we see many countries are doing that. Nigeria or Zimbabwe is doing that now, promoting Chinese in university. Even South Africa, I do believe. But even when they do that, as long as there's really no political will or strategy behind of like, why are we doing this? On we want people to learn we want people to speak Chinese for this and this, that purpose. At the end, since Chinese is really hard to learn, you're gonna spend 4 years learning Chinese, but if you find yourself 1 year not having to interact or doing anything related to China, I can guarantee you're gonna forget about that.
Yeah, the problem is not having the feeder systems to feed those people into foreign ministries. Kind of the foreign ministries have dire levels of Chinese competence. They need people who can speak Mandarin. They need people who can read Mandarin, particularly. And people who have China competence. There are a lot of Africans who have that capabilities, but they're not getting jobs in the foreign ministries. That's the real problem.
Yeah. I look forward to us speaking to some of these Chinese literacy challenges that a lot of African governments face a little bit later on in this interview. But maybe briefly, this whole idea of all the thousands of Africans that are going to pursue their studies in China, what can Western countries learn from that? Because we know in the past few years, there's been like more challenges for Africans to get student visas to study in formerly popular destinations for Africans, whether it be France, the UK, Canada, the US, so on and so forth, and even staying in these countries after. So, what are some of the differences that you guys see there in terms of what Africans that are looking to pursue their studies outside of the continent, what challenges that they face, and how these different poles kind of shape these students, groom these students, and create soft power for themselves in the African continent as a result of the people that they train?
I think it's the answer is simple: is make it easier for them to go. Make it easier for them to study there.
But they don't want them, though. I mean, let's be
but
clear,
this
they
is
don't want them.
like I think this is nothing but just gross racism. Actually,
That's what it is.
I think
That's exactly.
like it's just racism. Like it's institutionalized racism. Like we see the Nigerian, like very few diaspora populations has as high kind of achievement levels and academic certification levels as Nigerians overseas, right? Try to get a visa as a Nigerian, trying to go to any of these countries, try to get a study visa. Like you see year after year, Nigerians getting into all of the Ivies, getting access to, kind of to all of the different Ivy League universities in the US. These countries should be begging them to come. Like it's the fact that it's made so hard for them is nothing but racism. That's all it is, I think.
Yeah, I mean I 100% agree.
China became the main destination because it's not the first, but one of the main destinations, just because it was simple. It was easy to get a Chinese visa, a Chinese student visa. It was like study visa. You don't need to get through high hoops and to prove, I don't know how much, you didn't have to do that. And first of all, beside the scholarship that China was giving to African government, it was just cheap to go to study to China. I'm talking from my own experience. The 4 years plus language study I did in my bachelor degree in China, I paid for myself. It was not like scholarship. It was like easy. And the money we paid, it was like nothing compared to what we have to pay for my brothers who are studying in the US right now. So China was cheap and it was easy to get a student visa. So when you look in that context, for many African countries, it was like, yeah, I'm going to go to study to China because first of all, for many of them, we have to keep that in mind. Many African going to study has become one of the way to immigrate. It's an easy way to migrate from your country to another country. I'm starting to get my scholarship. I'm gonna get my student visa, and from there I'm gonna try to move forward. And that's how I see many in Europe, they kind of like, because they kind of understood that, they became like, yeah, we're going to make it very difficult for African students to come to France or to Europe. Try to imagine the kind of paperwork you need to prove just to get a student visa to go to France. It's crazy.
Yeah,
You're like, my friend, I got a scholarship, but you have to prove so many things that, guys, just drop it. I'm going to go to China. It's
But
straightforward.
that being said,
By the way,
Jomo,
it's true. So sorry, just on that point, Eric. This is true for Russia as well. Like I was recently speaking with a Zambian researcher, and she was, she was saying like it's so ironic to hear these kind of European and American kind of bewilderment about like why did the Africans vote so much with Russia around Ukraine? And she was like, this is why. It's because it's the one country where people can go to study.
yeah, but let's be fair here. It's more students still go to France than any other country in the world, including
True.
China.
That's true. France is still remaining the first destination for many African students in terms of going. I think it's remained, but it's changed because mid 2010 up to 2015, it was really hard for people to get to France, to go to study. Many were going to China. I think they kind of made things easy in a certain way. Because yes, the one problem with China was like, we go to China, but what's come after that? Especially when now, for many, when they go to study to China, there's no opportunity for them after you graduate from Chinese university to stay and live in China. People like me were like exception, like we finish and you find a job, you study to China. People were looking at us like, how did you manage that? So yes, for me, it was like, yeah, since China doesn't offer much more opportunities, it became kind of tricky. But yeah, China was easy to get to.
But to be fair, too, also there's been a pushback in China to the number of African students who
Yeah,
are
that's
coming.
true.
So
Recently,
the
yeah.
numbers are going down. There was a lot of frustration among Chinese students that African students on scholarship, for example, were given preferential dorm rooms, for example, that had air conditioning, and they were in foreign student dorms, whereas the local students had to live in much worse conditions, and they were paying full fare.
But
Also,
that
there,
that the thing, like for any foreign student in China, being on
Interesting.
exactly,
scholarship or not, any
but
foreign
that's right.
student in
But a lot
China,
of them were Africans,
yes,
though, in certain
exactly, had a
schools.
different treatment.
And then on top of that was the fact that the quality of education in China for universities varied widely. So some of them, like Renmin University that Giro went to, is excellent and it's consistently good. But a lot of the other schools that they went to were not that good. They didn't have programs set up for foreign students. They didn't really speak English that well. So there's a lot of frustration on the part of even some of the African students about the quality of the education that they got in China. So it's not all like you get to go to Canada, and generally
Yeah,
in
yeah.
Canada, there's a bandwidth of quality of education that you're going to get. And so a lot of the kids kind of came back and went, yeah, it wasn't really that great. The other thing, too, that we have to remember is that the China today is not the China that it was 10 years ago. They don't have the cash to throw around for as many scholarships as they had. And so the scholarship money is drying up in many respects. And what they do have, they want to spend domestically. So a lot of the trends we're seeing in the West are also starting to play out in China as well. We'll still see more, but it's not as much as it was, say, 5, 10 years ago.
Interesting. Um, Moving on to African debt, and I know that this is going to be a very interesting topic to a lot of our
Save the
listeners.
best for last, right? You don't have
Absolutely.
4 hours for your podcast, do you?
I
We
I
can.
know this is, oh geez, I don't, this is, and listen to our audience. For me, I just wish we could distill Eric, Giraud, and Cobus into like a very strong cocktail so that everyone could drink and just digest all of the knowledge that they have, because it's
Rants.
impossible to go over all of these things in a timely fashion. There's so much knowledge here. But let's talk about African debt. Where do Africans stand today? Maybe we start with the African debt trap and debunking that myth. Are the Chinese trying to indebt Africa to the point where we have to give away all of our natural resources? What are the realities of the question around the Chinese African debt trap?
Okay. Who wants to take that one?
I'm gonna take it. I'm
Go
gonna
for it,
let you
Joe.
take this. No, I'm gonna let you take this one because it's so laughable. At this point, this narrative. I'm just gonna set the tone. This narrative has become so stupid, annoying, and it's a real joke. It's a real joke, and it's annoying when you hear. Earlier, you spoke about the journalists when you talk about Western media. It's really annoying when you have a journalist from a Western media raising that question to you face to face with
I
a
know, but
serious
African
face.
journalists do the same thing.
Right,
Listen,
exactly.
African journalists have bought into this as much
Exactly.
as anybody else.
And African journalists is even worse. You move from African journalists to African decision makers, those who literally sign those contracts. But when they talk to you about China, they say, China is here to steal our infrastructure. You look at the guy, you say, my friend, you are among the one who negotiated it. Somehow you decided to buy into the narrative that somehow you don't even understand. So yeah, it's very annoying to the core. It's a kind of, for me, that debt draft narrative has become the sign of laziness. Laziness from journalists, laziness from decision makers who just decided, I'm not gonna read much. I'm not gonna go dig deep to and try to understand what does it mean, what does it imply. I'm just gonna stop to do what I've heard, I've read in Financial Times, in CNN, in France 24, and I'm gonna stop there. And for me, it's really annoying because it does not help Africa. This debt threat narrative is really so harmful to China-Africa relation in a way that Africa themselves, we don't look at that relationship with clear view to understand where are the problems in China debt financing, because there are other problems. It's not about China want to take infrastructure. There are so many other problems we can talk about without how China is not willing to cancel debt, how China is approaching those issue of that debt renegotiation, how China is ready to let Africa being streamed world because China want to revisit the international financial system with the West. We can talk about all the real issues, but we decide to skip those issues to really go and talk, China want to take Entebbe Airport in Uganda. Say, who told you that? China is about to take Mombasa Port. Who told you that? No, because they did that in Sri Lanka. Say, who told you that? And when you ask the who told
Which they
you
didn't
that,
even do in Sri Lanka, by the way.
and you go down to Sri Lanka, nothing happened. You're like, guys, are you serious? And that's why, sorry, I'm getting so emotional because it's annoying. That narrative is just annoying. It's a lazy narrative. And I think we should really move from that narrative.
Well, let me just give you a few, again, just kind of let's put everything into context with some of the numbers. Between 2000 and I think it's about 2018, 2019, China lent about $148 billion to various African countries. All of that combined accounted for about 12% of China's total public and private debt. 12%. Let's kind of keep that in context. A third of that $148 billion went to just one country, Angola. Okay? And that was an oil for infrastructure deal. And so Angola said, we have lots of oil, but we don't have infrastructure. The Chinese came and said, we have lots of cash, and we don't have a lot of oil. Let's swap. Okay? So that was a very special arrangement. So when we look at the other African countries, and there are about 10 of them, that account for the bulk of the rest of the debt. Let's look at Kenya, you can look at Zambia, you can look at Nigeria and Ghana. In Kenya, the debt accounts today for less than 8% of the $68 billion of total public debt. In Nigeria, we're looking at, I think it's about 4% of the total. And in Ghana, it's 3%. And also in Zambia, it's $6 billion and about a third of the total external debt. And so
we also have Ethiopia case, though.
Well, Ethiopia is the second largest, true. That's at about 14 billion. So that's a pretty sizable chunk of the debt. The point here is that these are minority shares in terms of when measured against the total public debt. Oftentimes you will see this manipulation of the numbers where they'll measure it against bilateral, external bilateral. And remember, a lot of countries like Nigeria and Kenya borrow about half domestically. And so about 50% of Kenya's debt comes from domestic sources. Then what you have is let's say 5 or 6 countries that have, a few $billion of Chinese debt on their balance sheet. That means about 48, 49 other African countries don't have a Chinese debt issue. So what happens when we say China and Africa, we're flattening out the continent. South Africa has no Chinese debt for the most part.
DRC does
has neither does the DRC. We can go down the list of countries that have no Chinese debt whatsoever. And so, again, what ends up happening is you kind of take these narratives and flatten out the continent, put whatever happens in Kenya, which is, again, not a debt crisis in that respect from the Chinese. The real problem, though, and this is why, Maurice, I would challenge you to find me one African president or prime minister who is on the record complaining about Chinese debt. Okay? You will not find one. Okay? What they are complaining about is private creditor debt, bondholder debt, IMF debt, World Bank debt, structural adjustment programs. We go down on the list of what African presidents and prime ministers complain about. You will not hear them complain about the Chinese, in part because the Chinese have actually been quite flexible in some respects in renegotiating some of it. We've seen restructuring deals in Angola. We've seen it now just approved in Ghana. They're finalizing in Zambia. Now, it took the Zambians 2 years, and the Chinese dragged that process out, but they did it. And we see lots of, other renegotiations in that respect. But one of the biggest reasons why you don't see this pressure is because it represents a really small share of the total public debt. Just go to the Nigerian Debt Management Office website. Search Nigeria DMO. Right there on the homepage, they have a debunking myths about the Chinese debt. It's right there. And this is from the Nigerian Debt Management Office. In full transparency, what each loan was taken out went to build infrastructure projects. They tie them right there together. And so, listen, I mean, I had drinks in Beijing a couple years ago with a guy who worked for the Exim Bank, the China Exim Bank, and he was laughing about how in Zambia there was this rumor that went around a couple years ago that China took control of the Zambian National Broadcasting Corporation, and this guy was just laughing. He's like, "Have you seen ZNBC? It is 2 sticks and a light bulb. I mean, these guys are crazy if they think we would even want it." And that's just not the Chinese MO. Okay, that, by the way, is a Western MO, because that's exactly what Western colonialists did. Is they took land, they took ports, they conquest. It was through conquest. What the
Right.
Chinese want in Africa is money. So that's when you look at the details of the contracts, okay? The Port of Mombasa was never going to be up as a piece of collateral for the standard gauge railway. Revenue from the Port of Mombasa was going to be used as collateral. And so people say, shock, horror. And I say to myself, well, wait a minute. The Chinese extended a loan. What did you want? And this is where you get the duplicity of a lot of Africans who will go to the Chinese and say, we don't want aid, we don't want charity, we want to do business. Well,
Right.
in business, you have to put up collateral against a loan, whether it's for your car, your house, or for a new railway. And so when the Chinese came and said, great, we want you to put money in an escrow account. We're going to put some conditions on that if you don't repay the loan, we're going to get paid back through some of your other resources. Either it's bauxite or there's the Port of Mombasa, but somehow we need to get paid back. As a creditor, that's not unreasonable. That's business. So you hear us get all worked up about this one because
I know you guys have spoken tremendously about this. Yeah.
it's frustrating on the African side, the Chinese side, and the Western side.
I think one important piece of context is that during the rapid increase of Chinese lending, there was a twinned rapid decrease in Paris club lending and bilateral lending from traditional government lenders like the US and France. What increased at the same rate or even faster than Chinese lending was Western private lending, which happens at not only at much higher interest rates, but also under much tougher conditions and under frequently highly inflated risk premiums. So there's we recently spoke to people from the One campaign who put out a report showing that Africans frequently, African lending is frequently 500% more expensive than it would be, to other comparative countries. So what we're actually looking at is the real scandal here is actually the restraints on financing to African countries in a context where they face both a developmental challenge and a climate challenge, and the kind of levels of wealth extraction from the south to the north is happening in the context of market lending. That is the real issue. And which is not to defend China. China has been incredibly problematic in lots of ways, but it is interesting that that even as there's all of this kind of blaming of China around, for example, the debt negotiation for Sri Lanka. What happened last week was that a Western private lender was literally suing Sri Lanka in federal court in New York for full repayment of the loan and interest, at a moment when the country is essentially bankrupt and in debt restructuring. So the government, the US government, had to literally intervene in order to stop one of their own private lenders from shaking down this country that can't pay for medicine. But for this to then be framed as China, this is kind of the new loan shark of the global south. It's come on, it's really ridiculous.
And what about the opacity of some of these contracts? A lot of people, and this is not just talking about Chinese loans in particular, but even the private creditors and whatnot. It seems as though some of the clauses in these loan contracts are not made available to the public. You hear a lot of these narratives in the media. What are your thoughts on some of these confidentiality clauses and the implications for
two couple very important points. 2 points to hear. First of all, these contracts are two-way contracts, right? So if the host government did not like the terms of the contract and said, we require under Zambian, Malian, Botswanan law to make sure that all tenders are made public, then there's nothing stopping them from negotiating that clause in the contract. What we saw in Kenya, was that under Kenyan law, under the Constitution, all contracts, procurement contracts, must be made public for the review. Who was it that fought bitterly to keep those private? Wasn't the Chinese.
The government.
William Ruto, it was Uhuru Kenyatta. So the African stakeholders are as much complicit in the opacity of these contracts as are the Chinese. Point number two on these, the vast majority of these Chinese contracts, based on what we know from aid data and from other sources, are based on Swiss commercial law. So these are terms that in many respects are actually quite consistent with most commercial contracts that you see. And what we hear from the scholars and the experts who are the specialists in this field is that at the end of the day, try going to find a German development contract in the public or even Canada. And what we hear is that China is slightly worse, but not an outlier by any measure in the secrecy of their loan contracts. That's again, we have that on the record from a number of different experts who study this quite closely.
Yeah, we spoke to people who developed all of these very sophisticated forensic like debt investigation tools in order to get to the Chinese contracts, and then they said they had to use the same tools to get to Western contracts. Because they weren't markedly more open than Chinese ones were.
And this is so interesting for African youth. For young Africans that are going to have to deal with these loans in the long term and deal with these sometimes poorly structured contracts. What advice do you guys have in terms of how do we hold leadership accountable for loans that a lot of you guys talk a lot about the gap between the average age of African leaders and the populations that they that they lead, essentially, right? So a lot of the people that are signing these contracts are going to be long gone before this generation, such as myself, are going to have to think about ways of paying them off. So what are your thoughts on how we can hold leadership accountable and address this?
Do you know the sad part of what you're mentioning is the fact that those young people right now in Africa are the political basis, fan bases of those old leaders who are signing those bad contracts. When you raise those kind of questions, they say, you should hold those people accountable. People look at those criticism under the spectrum of either tribalism, either the political tension in the country, through so different lenses that they don't want to hold accountable the leaders who are signing those bad contracts. Because somehow we kind of become so, I'd say, complacent toward those leadership that we don't want to see what they do wrong or what they do bad when they bad send us contracts. So for me, the advice I'm going to give them is that, guys, you should stand up. You should really, that champion that you like, that champion that you love as your president, as your party leaders, as your minister, you should really now push forward into asking him, you should be more transparent on how, about the contract that you've signed with the Chinese or with any kind of, with any lenders to name them. So that's the problem that we have as young African. We've become really complacent toward our own leadership. I think because of the political tension, the context of the political tension in our countries, we see the tribalism really rising up. That you see, when we want to criticize the leaders, you see the young people from that leaders tribe is going to be that, no, you don't want to question it. We cannot do that. You cannot doing. And we see the same kind of background when we talk about Kenya with Uhuru Kenyatta, William Ruto. We see the same debate over and over that kind of cripples the debates for real good debate about governance in Africa. So the young people they're trapped. They are trapped in that stupid political narrative in the country that they don't even realize that within 15 to 20 years, the leaders they were praising today is going to be dead. But the consequences of the bad contracts are going to be upon us. So I think we should really become more aware of the governance that we need to implement in our country and really free ourselves from different factors that just coming and cripples our mindset into that question.
But this comes back to our China literacy question as well. And again, this is not about speaking Chinese. This is understanding how the Chinese negotiate, how the Chinese write contracts, how the Chinese do business. And too often in Africa, there is a sense that anybody who is not Black African is white. And the problem is the Chinese are not white, and they don't think like white people do, they don't act like white people do, and they don't do business like white people do. And so what ends up happening is that too many African stakeholders are showing up to these negotiations, either in the corporate side and in the public sector side, not understanding how to do business with the Chinese and how they negotiate contracts. They are tough, and they're not messing around. And there is no second chance. For a lot of people, you still hear in Zambia, I heard the other day, from one of the opposition leaders, why aren't the Chinese giving us debt cancellation like the rest of the world does? They don't play like that. And this shows how the price of ignorance is really, really high. So we come back to all of these graduates from Chinese universities who have had the chance to learn, to live, and to understand the culture are not being put to work in these negotiating deal teams, okay, to sit on the other side, to be able to listen to what the Chinese are saying, negotiate better contracts, negotiate better deals. We saw after the Entebbe airport drama of a couple years ago, when the finance minister was called before a parliamentary oversight committee, and they said, how could you sign a contract like this? And it's on YouTube. And he said, we didn't understand the contract. And you know what? Your heart just sinks when you hear that. Because then you think, as Giraud said, and as what you've alluded to, generations of young people are going to be stuck with that bill because these jerks didn't understand the contract. The Chinese roll up, by the way, with $400 an hour private lawyers from Zurich and from London and from New York to negotiate some of these deals. If you're doing a $200 million airport deal, take a few $100,000 out of the budget and bring your own lawyers from New York, Washington, and London to negotiate on the other side of the Chinese. Instead, what they get oftentimes are mid-ranking African negotiators who have no experience in either Swiss corporate law or dealing with the Chinese or on some of these very complex infrastructure contracts. And they get worked, totally worked.
And one should point out that there are counterexamples. So we've interviewed Folashade Sule, for example, who's done very interesting work on Beninese negotiations with China and like how they managed to actually get quite a lot of stuff from the Chinese.
True. True.
But they, if you're gonna do that, you have to make that a priority. You have to kind of like do the work, and then she lists some of the kind of like techniques and ways that they did that. But you have to in a lot of ways it becomes an issue of putting African priorities first. And therefore, first knowing what African priorities are, being on the same page in terms of like what one is trying to achieve, and then being very hard nosed about making sure that not only that you have those priorities in place, but that you have the kind of people and teams and organization in place to be able to do that. Some African governments do achieve that. But what is needed is that for that to happen at a much higher level, for that to happen at a regional level, at a cross-border level, not only on a singular government level, but to coordinate between different African countries, and to then actually everyone pulling in the same direction. I think that is the issue frequently.
And I think also that there's this idea that a lot of Chinese debt comes from the central government, but there is more nuance there in terms of the different. Can you guys speak to how the institutional lenders from China actually are structured?
So basically, that's one of the issues that you mentioned. The perception that we have about China is the fact that when we say state-owned enterprise, for instance, we have in our imagination the same way in Africa we organize state-owned enterprises. We say, okay, if it's a state-owned enterprise, it means that it's controlled by the central government in the capital city, which is not always the case in China. In China, you have very stakeholders where you have like state-owned enterprise coming from the provincial levels, and you have some companies who are really controlled by Beijing directly. So all those actors, they do sometimes play different roles in the way they approach or their finance structures in Africa. So the main policy bank that really play the central role when it comes to financing in Africa, you have you have China Exim Bank and China Development Bank. Those banks are the main policy banks that were set to really extend loan to Chinese SOEs when they were investing in Africa, when they were doing big projects in Africa. We saw that, and most of and unless Eric is gonna correct me, most of the loans are coming from China Exim Bank, which was like the main
A
vehicle
lot
in
of them
terms,
do, yeah.
a lot of it, like a lot of the main vehicle on that. But later on, we saw now different bank coming into the fold. Commercial bank like ICBC, Industrial China, Industrial Development China, Bank of China. We have Construction Bank of China. You have Bank of China. All those commercial bank join the fold, are now sharing the burden with China Exim Bank, which CBD into lending into lending money into Africa. And we saw them coming in a moment where China start to realize that, African countries, they are not so sure in terms of reimbursing the money that we give them. So we need some way to integrate many actors into the fold, the way to share the cost, the way to share the burden in terms of those money that we lend to them. And this is where you see a lot of now provincial state-owned companies also now playing a major role into financing. Now you're gonna see a company, it's a state-owned company, but it's from a provincial level in the Henan, in Hunan, or in Zhejiang, coming and finding his own financing structure from a local bank in Zhejiang or his own provinces into now trying to find the financing in this project. So you have those different players that plays a major role when it comes to financing the financing from China to Africa.
This whole question of China literacy, right? Like, what is you guys' take on, like, if you guys have any advice for African leadership, right? Like, are African leaders reaching out to you guys for policy support and for policy advice? Can they reach out to you guys if they're interested? Like, the example that you gave of the finance minister in Uganda and what happened with the Entebbe airport, like that. That has immense implications for the future of millions of people. So how do we get African leadership to have the support that they need to be able to bring forward the kind of contracts that we need for the continent?
So we have a subscription service in addition to our podcast, and we have about 25 different governments around the world that subscribe to our service. Not one from Africa. Not one. Not a single one. We have a couple people who work in some of the foreign ministries individually subscribe, but not one. In fact, we've had people bring our service to various African foreign ministries and say, you guys really should get this. This is amazing. This is really helpful. It's not that expensive. You guys should do it. Again, money is not the issue, okay? Because we negotiate with them if we had to. And They go, no, I'm not going to listen to those guys. We had a bunch of the ambassadors in Beijing for a little bit that subscribed, and then they kind of quit. And so so the first step is you actually got to care. You got to take the step. This China stuff is really, really difficult. It is not easy to do. And the problem is that I think the historical orientation of Africa is still focused towards the West. Okay? So you can go into most foreign ministries and you will find a handful of people on their so-called China desks. And I say so-called because the China desks in these foreign ministries are really designed to basically be a 24-hour call service for the Chinese embassy to say, oh, you're having an event on Thursday? We'll send somebody. Oh, you want us to make a statement on this? We'll do something. They're not necessarily creating knowledge and policy and information and intelligence that's then feeding up to the key stakeholders. That's not what they're doing. And so too often what we find in many African governments, much as it is in other parts of the world, that patronage and nepotism and loyalty tend to be the most important qualities rather than information, intelligence, and knowledge on these issues. And that's ultimately the problem on the China space that we're finding.
Wow. And I guess as we head towards the end, this is we cannot cover this topic in there's no way. Listeners are gonna have to go and find this on you guys' website and in your podcast. But very, very briefly, we talk about BRICS. Can you briefly describe what BRICS is and what you think? Like, will this bring more value to? And I see Eric is smiling because he's like, "This is
No,
an
I mean, I'm going to
impossible."
let Jérôme do this because I can talk all night, but go ahead, Jérôme.
Absolutely. But like, does BRICS bring forward a new opportunity for the continent in terms of a new development partner, a new structure, or is this just another trend that's going to come and go, and Africans are going to once again have to come back to the drawing board and ask themselves, how do we move forward into the future?
I think it will be fair, since the last break was in South Africa, to let Kobus take a look at
That's a good
that.
point. And Cobus has a slightly more contrarian view and less negative
Exactly.
than I have, so I think that's fair.
I think it certainly does open some additional opportunities for Africa. It would very much depend, though, on Africa. And here, obviously, like Africa is this broad term that is itself not very useful, but African countries, but specifically clusters of African countries, to have very strong ideas about what they'd like to achieve, and then to be quite kind of hard nosed in using the political leverage that they have to extract whatever they can from these countries, particularly knowing that a lot of BRICS countries, China particularly, but also a lot of the Gulf countries, the newly joined ones, and India, are on the hunt for different kinds of international clout. So knowing that it is possible to get targeted kind of like cooperation from them, particularly around things like, for example, climate resilience, kind of, or renewable energy from some of them, or funding, different kind of infrastructure funding kind of possibilities. But one has to kind of be extremely strategic, extremely focused, and extremely hard-nosed in kind of using what they want in order to extract what you want. And I think kind of it becomes an issue then of African countries, A, deciding what their shared agenda is, and B, kind of finding ways of working together to achieve that.
Yeah, that's particularly fascinating. And there's an episode that you guys did after the most recent BRICS conference in South Africa that I'd urge our listeners to go and check out. I think you guys were able to provide a range of different insights as to where the BRICS are now and where the BRICS are heading, also with the recently added members as well, and what implications that has. I think we have 2 new members from the African continent, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
It's Ethiopia and Egypt.
So 3 total. I mean, think about what other kind of multilateral grouping has 3 out of 11 members are African. So that's a very strong, and none from Southeast Asia. So that's a very strong presence for Africa.
Yeah.
But I'll contend that I think the BRICS substantively is meaningless, especially because the 2 largest members hate each other beyond all recognition. Literally, the Indians and the Chinese now have somewhere in the range of 60,000 forces faced off against one another. No direct flights, no journalists. Their relationship is descending at just a horrific pace. So how could anything ever really get done of any substance when the 2 largest members are at odds with one another the way the Indians and the Chinese are? So, for example, a BRICS currency will require a central bank of some kind, whatever that form it takes, whether it's in the form of special drawing rights or gold or whatever. But there's no way that the Indians are ever going to tolerate China having disproportionate influence over that central bank. So that BRICS currency goes up in smoke. In terms of, to me, what the BRICS has value, really important value, is grievance, anger, resentment, the same type of grievance politics that propels Donald Trump and the MAGA movement in the US, the Brexit movement in the UK, the Yellow Jacket movement in France, this anger that the system is inherently unfair and unjust, and people have had enough. And I think that the rich people in the North ignore the BRICS movement at their peril if they don't pay attention to this grievance, because it will find lots of more destructive ways of manifesting itself other than the BRICS. But at the end of the day, to me, the BRICS is about grievance. And you saw this by virtue of the fact that they had a number of countries that they could have picked to admit on this first round of expansion. And what did they do? They took Iran. We now have a group that includes China, Russia, and Iran. If that isn't the biggest middle finger to the Europeans and the Americans, I don't know what is. Okay? This is about grievance, and this is about a big, giant FU to the global north. And I think that's a very powerful thing, and we need those forums and those spaces for that to happen. So I don't think it should be dismissed. I just don't think they're going to do anything in the form of real substance that's going to really change the equation, like to compete directly with the G7 or whatnot, because they don't have any shared commonality other than like, oh, you hate the US? I hate the US. That's great. Let's form a club. That is not enough.
Wow, incredible. And I like in the interest of time, let's start wrapping up. I'm gonna give you guys this opportunity. We have towards the last section of our podcast, we have this section called Plug Talk that allows you to, share any projects, initiatives that you guys are working on that you'd like our public to know about. And I'd like you guys to speak to that. But I'd actually like to give you guys the opportunity to make a pitch to African governments that could potentially benefit from the work that you guys do and some of the advice that you guys could bring forward to them. What would you, if there's an African, official that's listening now, what would you provide them? What can you bring forward to the table to help them, strengthen the deals that they make with either China or foreign players, and some of the policy recommendations that you give them for the work that they're doing?
So what we're doing right now as a China Global South, as I was speaking about it earlier, is like we really do cover, we are focused on to covering what China does in Africa and even the Global South. But the one, since we're focusing on the leaders in Africa, is like we are really following closely, monitoring what China does in terms of investment, politics, economics, and everything. We provide insight we have a team that provide insight in terms of what China think, what's the dynamic inside of China, and how that dynamic is played outside in China's interaction with Africa. We follow China closely in a different space where it evolves, and we are really able to provide you that kind of insight that, many they don't have. And you have a strong team of people who have a very strong China background, people who've worked, lived, studied, speak Chinese, know China mindset and how China works and how China evolved in the global south in China, how China evolved in Africa. So yes, we're really there to really help Africa, to really help us to move forward, to really have a real win-win relationship with China. Because so far we've been repeating that, win-win relationship, but we've never we've never given ourselves all the tools and all the changes that we do have at our disposal to really create that environment where you're going to have a win-win relationship with China. And I think that's what China Global South and the China in Africa podcast going to provide in terms of this team of China Global South is going to provide us insight and information that really is going to help a lot of African leaders to really improve their China knowledge. And I'm not going to mention all different projects that we do have on China's mining presence in Africa, China's mining presence in Indonesia, China mining presence in Zimbabwe, China mining presence in many places in the global south. Those projects are going to come. They're going to see the day of light in the coming weeks and coming months, and you're gonna really see the kind of work that we do provide in the China Global South that gives you that kind of insight and look into what China does and what China does and what China does not do in the Global South.
Awesome. And where can we find all of you? What are your handles on X, formerly known as Twitter, and other social media?
So you can find us on our English website, www.chinaglobalsouth.com, and French website, www.projetafriquechine.com, and we have the Arabic website as well. I'm sorry, I cannot give you the end.
Just look for the Arabic at the top.
You're gonna find it in the Arabic on the top. On X, you're gonna find at Afriquechine for the French and the Projet Afriquechine. You're gonna find me myself, Christian Géraud. You're gonna find also China Global South in X. In terms of handle, you're gonna find our personal X handle Eric Olander and Cobus Van Staden. You're gonna find us. We're also present on LinkedIn, where we really have very interesting free debate with Africans and African intellectuals and businessmen about different issues that when we talk about China is in the global south and in Africa. So yeah, those are the places we can find us. You can also find us on YouTube, because we have a YouTube channel where we have our videos, our podcast videos, and our different shows that we used to do. I'm gonna resume doing those shows this week.
Yeah.
We're gonna have a different shows again this week, and the coming weeks you're gonna have our own China Global South show where you're gonna have the three of us talking about all these issues. And
Scary.
yes, you're really welcome to come and join us and join the debate and the discussion on that.
When we look at the mega trends of the 21st century, we see climate change, we see AI, we see COVID and pandemics. Now, increasingly, we're seeing war. But China is one of the mega trends of the 21st century. And if you go through life not understanding what China's doing, not only in Africa, but understanding the context of where Africa fits within the broader picture. And that's one of the reasons why we transitioned away from the China-Africa project to the China Global South project, was specifically to give African stakeholders a context. So you cannot look at everything through a straw, but you're looking at it through the widest prism possible. And so the message to young people is that whether you like it or not, whether you get it or not, China is going to shape your destiny. And just the same way climate change and AI is going to shape their destinies. So for young people, they need to be motivated to put as much effort into understanding China as they do into these other megatrends. For the policymakers, I don't know what to say, because the information's been there. What's bad about the policymakers is not only is their knowledge missing, what knowledge they have is actually 10 years out of date, and it's destructive, and it's lazy, and it's costing them and their communities and their constituents real power and money. And so I think young people should hold their governments to account to saying they need to do better on this. And that's just the bottom line.
And I guess for Cobus, as a parting question, what advice do you have for young Africans as far as how we think about structuring relationships with the world in order to drive the development that we want to see in our communities?
I think find policymakers and vote for them if you happen to be in a democracy. Find policymakers that actually care about whether your country develops or not. That's the basic. A lot of African policymakers don't care whether the countries develop or not. And so if you can find policymakers who do, then go with them, and then put a lot of pressure on them to make sure that they actually do things that will help development. And and that would include things like climate resilient development, for example.
Listen, thank you all so much for this, intro to China and Africa. We jumped around and touched a range of different topics, each of which could be an hour-long podcast in and of themselves. And so to get some more of those deep insights, I encourage you all once again to go and check out their website, listen to their podcast. My Sunday long runs are China and Africa podcast days for me. So I ran my first marathon this year, and I think the first half of the marathon I was listening to you guys actually.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we're helping you get healthy. That's really exciting.
Absolutely. So without further ado, big thank you to Eric, to Jérôme, to Cobus for being with us here today. Please stay tuned for more episodes from us. Once again, it's a big pleasure to have you all listening in. And from the Project Umoja team, thank you. And till next time.